Today in world literature, we turn to the study of the poetry of North America in the second half of the 20th century. Our presenter, Dr. Bert Kimmelman, argues that the poets such as Adrienne Rich, Rita Dove, Margaret Atwood, and Frank O'Hara and Allen Ginsberg particularize psychological reality. Their skepticism is great. There's loss of privacy and a potential loss of individuality. And yet there is something positive, a new reality, a kind of individual valor to be found in this poetry.
All the experimental elements that existed in the modern American poetry of the first half of the 20th century were still in place in the second half. However, there are differences between the earlier and later poetries. For one thing, the degree of formal experimentation in the work of the earlier poets was so great and was viewed as being so successful that in general formal experiments did not continue. Behind the younger poets has loomed a powerful literature which early in the century registered great innovations and consolidations. All the same, the newer poets have liked to invade areas of awareness both commonplace and exotic, have striven for diversity of thought and cultural gestures, all of which may have been neglected by their predecessors. The newer poets have especially explored psychological depths, human interiors, and many of their poems, such as we will read shortly, are involved with particularizing one or another inner reality and with defining the self according to it. Moreover, later 20th century poetry at times will concern itself precisely with the very search for psychological meaning and with the idea that there is a unique self, not unlike the earlier poetry's tendency to parade itself as poetry, to talk about the act and process of poetry and its effects. The newer poets write with greater candor and a skepticism of accepted personal and social values, which in part are the result of the Second World War, so horrific in scale and practice that all romantic notions of human nobility are impossible to express. Also, atomic weaponry and high technology in general, especially within the field of communications, have made people feel that they are at one and the same time thrown together, not only physically, such as in Ezra Pound's poem In a Station of the Metro, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, so that people are psychically crowded. This situation results in a loss of privacy and dignity. And even more than in the earlier modernism, the later poetry reveals the fear of losing one's individuality. Thus, the poetry has often relinquished the option to make direct statements, as if such coherence could not adequately express the feelings of anonymity and the impotence of a postmodern world. Moreover, the new poetry's frank yet oblique point of view has arisen because of the changing face of North America, as it became by the 1960s more accepting of alternative lifestyles and of various cultures other than Western European in origin, not least because of the poetry of the 50s that championed eclecticism and proclaimed the self in crisis. If there is one basic element the later poetry shares with the early modern, it is the desire to explore new perceptions and aesthetics through dissolving the strictures of traditional poetic forms and searching for newer forms appropriate to what is being said in the moment, so that the sense of the present becomes even more vivid than in earlier poetic experiments. As the contemporary poet Robert Creeley opined, style is nothing more or less than an extension of content. Beyond this writerly goal, the later poetry also shares a love for alternative dictions and patterns of speech other than the classical, although the later poetry is not necessarily rejecting overtly the distant classical past. And in fact, the later poetry often seeks to echo that past within its innovations in a postmodern irony, also to be seen, for instance, in contemporary architecture or art. Also noteworthy is the fact that the later poetry is more greatly varied. There is no one single kind of postmodernism as there was a modernism, in part because of a greater societal tolerance in North America in recent decades, giving rise to sexual freedoms, a call for racial equality, and feminism. North America demographically is divided into many subcultures such as Native American or lesbian, or sociologically into political or social protest, and so on. To a great extent, the romanticized notion of the poet as an outsider or rebel has become the fact. Literary innovation led poets into so many new directions, and political and cultural diversification provided poets with so many new themes that consensus has become rare as compared with the past. Thus, we find a great range of subject matter in the newer poetry, a continuation of idiosyncratic forms of prosody, of poetic forms, while the poets have introduced worlds of historical, mythological, political, scientific, biological, and geographical matter into their poems. All the same, the current that runs through virtually all of the new poetry is the search for a self, the construction of a self. Let us now turn to a few of these postmodern poems and read them, and try to place them within the context of modernism and its afterglow. We will discuss 5 poems from the post-1950s period, or that is to say, from the 1950s and beyond. We'll point out the traits in each that exemplify the trends I have just outlined. We will conclude then by talking about how the poems fit with each other within the postmodern context that I have been describing. The first of these poems is called Diving into the Wreck by Adrienne Rich. Let's read the poem together. First, having read the Book of Myths and loaded the camera and checked the edge of the knife blade, I put on the body armor of black rubber, the absurd flippers, the grave and awkward mask. I am having to do this not like Cousteau with his assiduous team aboard the sun-flooded schooner, but here alone. There is a ladder. The ladder is always there, hanging innocently, close to the side of the schooner. We know what it is for, we who have used it. Otherwise, it is a piece of maritime floss, some sundry equipment. I go down, rung after rung, and still the oxygen immerses me, the blue light, the clear atoms of our human air. I go down. My flippers cripple me. I crawl like an insect down the ladder, and there is no one to tell me when the ocean will begin. First the air is blue, and then it is bluer, and then green, and then black. I am blacking out, and yet my mask is powerful. It pumps my blood with power. The sea is another story. The sea is not a question of power. I have to lean alone to learn alone to turn my body without force in the deep element. And now it is easy to forget what I came for among so many who have always lived here, swaying their crenellated fans between the reefs. And besides, you breathe differently down here. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes. The words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. I stroked the beam of my lamp slowly along the flank of something more permanent than fish or weed, the thing I came for. The wreck and not the story of the wreck. The thing itself and not the myth, the drowned face always staring toward the sun, the evidence of damage worn by salt and sway into this threadbare beauty, the ribs of the disaster curving their assertion among the tentative haunters. This is the place. And I am here, the mermaid whose dark hair streams black, the merman in his armored body. We circle silently about the wreck. We dive into the hold. I am she, I am he, whose drowned face sleeps with open eyes, whose breasts still bear the stress, whose silver, copper, vermeil cargo lies obscurely inside barrels, half wedged and left to rot. We are the half-destroyed instruments that once held to a course, the water-eaten log, the fouled compass. We are, I am, you are, by cowardice or courage, the ones who find our way back to this scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear. The speaker in this poem, the diver, penetrates a region mistakenly held to be unspoken, even unspeakable. It is an alien region, yet she finds there her true self, her own body. The wreck can be read as an icon standing for the true poetry she has found by delving into the past, but raising that past into the light of a new day, or at least swimming back to the surface of the water as a unified, whole human being who has found something that was naggingly missing. It is her true poetic voice. It is also her sexual identity as a lesbian, found after a lifetime of being a heterosexual wife and mother. So in the wreckage of her past, she will make a new start. The return from the wreck also mimics the evolution from fish to mammal to fully realized human self. Her journey toward knowledge takes her to the realization that the self is anonymous, yet that is its glory, for it is essentially human. As the speaker says at the end of the poem, no names appear, and that, ironically, is the greatest treasure of all. The search for self, be it nameless or unique or both, but in any case surely precious to the poet, is also articulated in Rita Dove's poem, Wingfoot Lake, Independence Day, 1964. In this poem, the individuality the poet yearns for is subsumed within the need to identify with a group, namely African Americans. Yet to do so is a problem, since that group itself is struggling to know who and what it is. Let's now read this poem. On her 36th birthday, Thomas had shown her her first swimming pool. It had been his favorite color, exactly, just so much of it, the swimmer's white arms jutting into the chevrons of high society. She had rolled up her window and told him to drive on, fast. Now this act of mercy, 4 daughters dragging her to their husband's company picnic, white families on one side of them, on the other, unpacking the same squeezed bottles of Heinz, the same waxy beef patties and Salem potato chip bags. So he was dead for the first time on 4th of July. 10 years ago had been harder, waiting for something to happen, and 10 years before that, the girls like young horses eyeing the track. Last August, she stood alone for hours in front of the TV set as a crow's wing moved slowly through the white streets of government. That brave swimming scared her, like Joanna saying, "Mother, we're Afro-Americans now." What did she know about Africa? Where were there lakes like this one, with a rowboat pushed under the pier? Or Thomas's great Mississippi, with its sullen silks? There was the Nile, but the Nile belonged to God. Where she came from was the past, 12 miles into town, where nobody had locked their back door, and Goodyear hadn't begun to dream of a park under the company's symbol, a white foot sprouting 2 small wings. Any black writer in America must confront as an adult the enraging truth that the inescapable social accusation of blackness becomes, too early for the child to resist it, a strong element of inner self-definition. In this poem, the speaker mourns the loss of her husband, and now alone must look out on the future as embodied in her daughters, whom she sees as both part of and separate from the white world of rank and privilege, as indicated by the image of the white arms forming a chevron, a sign of military rank. The poem's impact comes from this and other imagery that becomes symbolic. The The white swimming pool is counterpointed by lakes both in America and Africa, and by American rivers like the Mississippi and African rivers like the Nile. The rivers indicate the journey into a present of consumerism and loss of individuality. We are all like the mass-produced, infinitely repeated ketchup bottles and ritual picnics of contemporary American society. Buried deep within this poem is the poet's mourning for the loss of all history and culture other than this throwaway culture, represented by the wax paper and cellophane of the picnic, these inorganic materials, which are the dregs of the picnic remaining after everyone has gone home. Dove examines the dynamics of an interracial and unequal American society, but finally she makes an appeal to our common humanity. Many of her poems, moreover, are written out of her sense of history with all its elaborate injustices, yet she can also express fear that cultures and histories are disappearing. The picnic imagery seems pleasant enough, but the loss of history it comes to represent also presents us with a menace, that of a meaningless society. And when there is meaninglessness, violence can take over. Writing from a decidedly more feminist perspective than Dove, the Canadian poet Margaret Atwood also manages to appeal to our common humanity, and in doing so, she calls our attention to the singular plight of women in our society. In her poem Owl Song, she exposes the genteel discrimination and victimization of women as gritty and dire. Furthermore, she discloses the anger that victimized women feel in all its raw ferocity. Let's now read her poem. I am the heart of a murdered woman who took the wrong way home, who was strangled in a vacant lot and not buried, who was shot with care beneath a tree, who was mutilated by a crisp knife. There are many of us. I grew feathers and tore my way out of her. I am shaped like a feathered heart. My mouth is a chisel, my hands the crimes done by hands. I sit in the forest talking of death, which is monotonous. Though there are many ways of dying, there is only one death song. The color of mist. It says, why? I do not want revenge. I do not want expiation. I only want to ask someone how I was lost. How I was lost. I am the lost heart of a murderer who has not yet killed, who does not yet know he wishes to kill, who is still the same as the others. I am looking for him. He will have answers for me. He will watch his step. He will be cautious and violent. My claws will grow through his hands and become claws. He will not be caught. The menace of urban life, now as familiar to Canadians as people in the United States in recent years, is brought home to us in one swift mention of a vacant lot where a woman can find herself not cornered, but rather surrounded by rape and mutilation, with nowhere to run and no help forthcoming from any quarter. Yet what lies beneath the adversarial relationship? In the anger of the poem's speaker, the truth of commonality emerges. We can, any of us, be either victim or predator. Yet this answer is quite unsatisfying. Our lives should be better than this kill or be killed scenario. What that answer is, however, we are not told. All we can tell is that ultimately one's identity may be nothing more than the hate and violence depicted in the poem. Atwood means to shock us toward action by showing us how desperate, to borrow from Rich's poem with an ironic twist, how desperate namelessness can be when we are, as it were, disappeared by hate and ignorance. Atwood's triad, commonality, anonymity, and self, is an extension of a tradition that begins with earlier poets like Frank O'Hara and Allen Ginsberg. In the two poems by them we will now read, we see the fear of selflessness expressed not through images of abject violence and terror, but through common scenes that can be quite comical, though no less poignant. Here is Ginsberg's poem, A Supermarket in California. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman, for I walk down the side streets under the trees with a headache, self-conscious, looking at the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit market, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches and what penumbras, whole families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca, what were you doing down by the watermelons? I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I heard you asking questions of each. Who killed the pork chops? What price bananas? Are you my angel? I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans following you, and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing every frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight? I touch your book and dream of our odyssey in the supermarket and feel absurd. Will we walk all night through solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade, lights out in the houses. We'll both be lonely. Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America of love past blue automobiles and driveways, home to our silent cottage? Ah, dear father, graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, what America did you have when Sharon quit poling his ferry and you got out on the smoking bank and stood watching the boat disappear on the black waters of Leith? Or of Lethe, Leith. Sorry. Ginsberg's aligning himself with Walt Whitman, the two poets' styles have much in common, is meant to ground the younger poet's sense of self with an historical continuum. Yet, as in Dove's poem, again, history has disappeared, replaced now by a mindless commodification of experience, seen as timeless. The supermarket is virtually always open, and therefore no time is special. The world is emptied out of meaning. However, Ginsberg, a marvelous anarchist, takes great delight in his predicament. He will celebrate the present, its utter sensuousness alone, if no deeper meaning is forthcoming. Nevertheless, Whitman must be his courage teacher, as the search for substantiality must continue. There is to be no giving up for Ginsberg, and in fact the supermarket, like other artifacts of contemporary life, is subjected to his criticism. On the other hand, Ginsberg meets with the great modern Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca, and with Whitman in the store. This conjuncture is meant to echo, ironically, the great medieval poet Dante's meeting with the great poets of the classical world in the Divine Comedy. And that association is also suggested by the crossing of the river at the end of the poem. Thus, Ginsberg is wittily telling us that the poetry of today, for it to be vital, must celebrate the present. The past need not be rejected so much as incorporated into the present, here with biting humor. The present can be satirized, as Ginsberg does, when he alludes to both his and Whitman's homosexuality and to the contemporary recreational character of consumerism, that people in supermarkets turn into voyeurs, that in fact some people go to these otherwise banal places to meet people, to establish sexual and emotional liaisons. Yet the rhythms of the natural world have been disrupted, as indicated by the fruit and vegetables glimmering under the late night electric lights. And therefore the ultimate outcome of such liaisons is open to question. Nevertheless, this is the world as Ginsberg has found it, and this is his ultimate point in the poem. That Ginsberg makes his deepest point obliquely is also typical of post-World War II poetry. For as has been said, direct statement has come to be seen as inadequate to express the fundamental shift in reality of contemporary life. Perhaps oblique expression is more truthful also because intellectual paradigms such as we see in contemporary physics and mathematics also suggest that indirection, paradoxically, is the most efficient route towards one's goals. In Frank O'Hara's poem, Why I Am Not a Painter, arbitrariness and indirection is not only the poem's modus operandi, but its point as well. Let's now read that poem. I am not a painter, I am a poet. Why? I think I would rather be a painter, but I am not. Well, for instance, Mike Goldberg is starting a painting. I drop in. Sit down and have a drink, he says. I drink. We drink. I look up. You have sardines in it. Yes, it needed something there. Oh. I go and the days go by and I drop in again. The painting is going on and I go and the days go by. I drop in. The painting is finished. Where's sardines? All that's left is just letters. It was too much, Mike says. But me? One day I am thinking of a color, orange. I write a line about orange. Pretty soon it is a whole page of words, not lines. Then another page. There should be so much more, not of orange, of words, of how terrible orange is, and life. Days go by. It is even in prose. I am a real poet. My poem is finished and I haven't mentioned orange yet. It's 12 poems. I call it Oranges. And one day in a gallery, I see Mike's painting called Sardines. In talking about how a painting and thereby how a poem can get made, O'Hara means to suggest some truths about the creative process, about contemporary reality, and about his own construction of a self. He finds that all of these concepts evolve from an interplay of the arbitrary and the necessary. Yet finally, this poem and its speaker are a mask of the poet's real identity. On the other hand, to peel away that mask is to find yet another mask. There is only really the exuberance of life. This is the self for O'Hara, which itself only has meaning in the face of death. Thus, the arbitrary assignation to the oranges that they are, quote, terrible as life, is not so capricious after all. And furthermore, we appreciate the oranges because of their fleeting nature. O'Hara celebrates the fleeting nature and precariousness of life with a delicacy and memorableness that is unparalleled. Human fortitude, he wants to tell us, resides in the ephemeral and telling gestures of personality, the lusts and refusals of an identity anxiously scrutinized for the signs of difference, and thereby individuality as much as it may be possible. The poem turns literature inside out. The subject matter is the process of the poem, and hence the poem suggests that we are our inward and then outward turnings, nothing more. Therefore, as in Ginsberg, we have to live in the present. We have no choice in that, really. All of these poets opt for the present, essentially make no plans, and look with a jaundiced eye on the past. The beauty of their predicament, then, is their willingness to stake a claim in a shifting ground, and to insist that they live there even though the outcome is very much in doubt. They analyze contemporary life for us and show us through a new kind of heroism how to live in it. They live with the essential paradox that the world, with all its new possibilities of technology and social organization, is also cramped and threatened by its very own energies. These poets do not feel bound to provide solutions to this dilemma, yet they have articulated it with a new and profound eloquence that is appropriate to the conditions of present existence.
There is great variation in contemporary North American poetry. The literature of the United States, as Dr. Kimmelman illustrates, incorporates themes and material at once thought non-literary. Experimentation is central to a nation in which privileged positions are rejected and diversity is celebrated. It is this sense of experimentation and diversity that explains why contemporary U.S. literature is provocative, and why African-American writers such as Toni Morrison, whose novel Beloved is the subject of the next two lectures, are among the most intriguing authors writing today.